In March 2013, Łukasz Slabaszewski was 31 years old and living in Peterborough, Cambridgeshire, a mid-sized English city about 80 miles north of London. He was a Polish national who had come to England looking for work, like thousands of other Eastern Europeans who had settled in Peterborough over the previous decade. He lived in shared housing, the kind of multi-occupancy property common in cities where rents are low and tenants are temporary. He got by on casual employment. He was not wealthy, not prominent, and not someone whose name would have meant anything to anyone outside the small community of people he saw day to day. John Chapman was 56. He also lived in Peterborough, in the same network of shared properties and bedsits that housed many of the city's more short-term residents. Chapman knew the people around him. He was part of a loose community where people looked out for each other in small ways, sharing cigarettes, swapping information about available work, keeping company in a world that could feel isolating. Kevin Lee was different from both of them. Lee was a local property landlord. He was married. He had children. He ran a business managing rental properties across Peterborough, many of them the same kind of shared houses and bedsits that Slabaszewski and Chapman called home. Lee had a stable life, a family that depended on him, and a reputation in the community. He also had a secret. He was having an affair with one of his tenants. Within 10 days of each other, all three of these men would be gone, attacked with a knife, dumped in ditches across the Cambridgeshire countryside, taken by the same woman. Her name was Joanna Dennehy. She was 30 years old at the time. She took the lives of Łukasz Slabaszewski, John Chapman and Kevin Lee between March 19th and March 29th, 2013. She attacked each of them with a knife, striking them repeatedly. She disposed of their bodies in rural drainage ditches with no real attempt at concealment. And then, rather than stopping or running, she travelled 100 miles south to the city of Hereford, where she attacked two complete strangers with a knife, both men out walking their dogs, before police arrested her. Both men in Hereford survived. One suffered serious injuries. 3 men in Peterborough did not survive. Slabaszewski had come to England from Poland looking for a better life. Chapman had lived in Peterborough for years, part of the shared housing community that absorbed the city's most vulnerable residents. Lee had a mortgage, a marriage, and children who called him Dad. Their lives, their futures, and everything they might have become ended in the span of 10 days because of one woman who, as the court would later establish, acted not for money, not for revenge, and not to cover up something else. She did it because she enjoyed it. The judge who sentenced Dennehy gave her a whole life order, the most severe sentence in English law. She will never be released. This is the full account of what Joanna Dennehy did, who the men she went after were, how she was caught, and what the evidence revealed about the person behind what happened. Everything that follows comes from the established court findings, sentencing remarks, and widely documented reporting from her 2014 trial. The story begins not with what happened, but with the woman who committed them, and the world she built around herself in the city of Peterborough. To understand what happened in March 2013, you have to understand the life Dennehy was living before the first knife was ever raised. Part 2. Joanna Dennehy was born in 1982 in St Albans, Hertfordshire, a commuter town north of London where rows of Victorian terraces sit alongside newer housing estates, and the daily rhythm of life is shaped by school runs, train timetables, and weeknight supermarket trips. It is an ordinary place, the kind of town where neighbours wave to each other and children grow up within walking distance of where they were born. Dennehy did not stay in that world. She left school early before completing her education. Substance misuse was documented as part of her history from a young age, a pattern that would persist throughout her adult life. The relationships she formed during her adolescence and early adulthood were, by all accounts presented during the trial, unstable and short-lived. She could not hold a partnership together. She could not hold a living situation together. She moved through people and places at a pace that left no roots behind, no stability, and no lasting connections of the kind that anchor most people to their communities. The pattern that defined Dennehy's life was not dramatic. It was relentless, a slow, grinding cycle of instability, aggression, substance problems, and broken connections that repeated itself for years. The court that eventually tried her did not explore her childhood in exhaustive detail. What was presented was behavioural history, a documented record of troubled conduct that predated the events of 2013 by many years. The prosecution used this record not as an excuse for what Dennehy did, but as context. What happened in March 2013 did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of a life that had been marked by instability and aggression for as long as anyone could document. At some point, Dennehy moved to Peterborough. The city offered something that a small commuter town like St Albans did not: a large, short-term population where someone with her history could disappear into the margins without drawing attention. Peterborough's housing market in 2013 included a significant number of shared properties and bedsits, many of them managed by private landlords and housing tenants who were themselves dealing with substance issues, unstable employment, or the kind of unstable circumstances that make settled life difficult. Dennehy fit into this world without friction. She lived in shared housing. She built social circles around partying and substance use. The people she spent time with were often dealing with their own problems, people in temporary accommodation who moved frequently and communicated informally. In this environment, a person could vanish for days and nobody would think twice about it. A person could behave unpredictably and it would register as normal. The community Dennehy moved through was, in a very real sense, invisible to the rest of the city. It was within that invisible community that Dennehy met the three men she would eventually take the lives of, and it was there that she began the relationship that would place her at the centre of everything that followed. Kevin Lee, the married property landlord, entered Dennehy's life through his work. He managed rental properties. She was a tenant. The professional relationship became personal. An affair began. Lee kept it hidden from his wife and children. Dennehy, for her part, had gained access to someone who occupied a completely different social position from the men she usually associated with. Lee had stability. He had money. He had a life outside the margins. And now he had a secret that bound him to a woman whose history of instability he may not have fully understood. Dennehy was also associating with a man named Gary Stretch during this period. Stretch would later plead guilty to assisting an offender after what she did. His presence in Dennehy's circle demonstrated that she was not entirely alone. She had people around her who, for their own reasons, were willing to follow her lead without asking difficult questions. By early 2013, Dennehy's substance misuse continued. Her behaviour remained chaotic and unpredictable. Her relationships were marked by manipulation and rapid shifts in mood. None of this was new, but something was different about the early months of 2013. The aggression that had been a feature of her life for years was no longer diffuse. It was sharpening, focusing, turning into something specific. The fracture had already begun. The people closest to Dennehy just could not see it yet. The nature of that fracture was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow accumulation of behaviours that, viewed in isolation, might have seemed like the ordinary chaos of Dennehy's life. But viewed together, and with the benefit of hindsight, they formed a clear trajectory. The aggression that had always been present in her relationships was intensifying. The instability that had marked her interactions was becoming more extreme, and the substance misuse that had been a constant feature of her life was not moderating, it was deepening. People who lived around Dennehy in Peterborough during this period existed in a world where chaotic behaviour was the norm. In the shared housing network, people drank heavily, used substances, argued, reconciled, and argued again, as a matter of routine. The baseline for what counted as concerning was already elevated. A person had to do something genuinely alarming to stand out. Dennehy, for all her instability, had not yet crossed that line in a way that triggered intervention or alarm among the people in her immediate circle. The relationship with Kevin Lee continued during this period, though the evidence presented at trial suggested it was deteriorating. Lee was still visiting Dennehy. He was still maintaining the affair. He was still keeping it hidden from his family. Whatever he was seeing in Dennehy's behaviour, it was not enough to make him break contact. Whether this was because he did not recognise the danger, because he believed he could manage it, or because the entanglement was simply too deep to pull himself out of without consequences, the result was the same. He stayed. Slabashevsky and Chapman, the other two future targets, were also present in Dennehy's orbit during these final weeks. They were part of the same community. They crossed paths with her in the ordinary course of daily life. They had no reason to be afraid. In their world, Dennehy was just another person in the shared housing network. Someone with problems, certainly, but not someone who triggered the kind of alarm that would have sent them running. That failure of recognition, the inability of the people around Dennehy to see what was coming, was not a failure of intelligence or attention. It was a failure of imagination. The idea that the unstable, aggressive, substance-using woman in their midst was about to become a repeat offender was, quite simply, not something that occurred to anyone. It was not something that occurs to anyone because it is extremely rare. Female repeat offenders who attack at close range in a compressed 10-day spree do not exist in the normal framework of everyday risk assessment. The ordinary world held, the fracture widened beneath it, and on March 19, 2013, the ground gave way. Part 3. Kevin Lee was a man living in two worlds. In one, he was a husband and father with a property business and a stable home. In the other, he was having an affair with a tenant who had a documented history of instability, aggression, and substance misuse. He kept these worlds separate. His family did not know about Dennehy. The people in the shared housing network did not know the full details of his personal life. Lee moved between these realities as though the wall between them would hold indefinite. The court heard evidence that Dennehy used manipulation within the relationship. She was described as deeply unstable, swinging between apparent affection and sudden aggression. Lee appears to have believed he could manage the situation. He continued the affair, even as Dennehy's behaviour grew increasingly difficult to predict. His position as her landlord gave him authority on paper, but the reality of their dynamic was far more complicated. Dennehy depended on Lee for housing. Lee depended on Dennehy's discretion to keep the affair hidden. Each had leverage over the other, and that mutual dependency created a relationship that was inherently unstable. Lee did not understand that Dennehy's instability was not a phase, it was an escalation, and by the time the relationship began to deteriorate, the trajectory toward harm was already set. The evidence presented at trial indicated that the relationship broke down in the weeks before the first act. The specifics of what passed between Lee and Dennehy during this period were not fully detailed in open court, but the trajectory was clear to those who reviewed the evidence. Dennehy was becoming more unpredictable, not less. The manipulation intensified, the unpredictability worsened, and Lee, entangled in an affair he could not safely end and could not safely continue, was trapped. Lee was not the first person Dennehy targeted. That distinction belongs to Lukasz Slabaszewski, who was gone days before Lee. But Lee's relationship with Dennehy is the fracture point that makes the entire case legible. It shows how Dennehy operated, drawing people in, creating dependency, exploiting proximity, and then turning on the people who trusted her. Slabaszewski trusted her enough to come to her residence when she invited him. Chapman knew her well enough to be in her company without alarm. Lee was intimate with her. All three men believed they understood who Dennehy was. All three were wrong. Each of them had formed their assessment of Dennehy based on the person she presented to them. A person who was unstable, certainly, but not someone they perceived as mortally dangerous. The gap between what they believed about her and what she was capable of was the space in which the acts took place. That gap is the central feature of the case. Dennehy did not overpower those she targeted through physical superiority. She did not ambush them from concealment. She used familiarity. She used trust. She exploited the basic human assumption that the people we know, the people we spend time with, the people we allow into our homes, are not going to harm us. That assumption, so fundamental that most people never consciously think about it, was what Dennehy used most effectively. By mid-March 2013, Dennehy had access to all three men. She had proximity, she had trust, and she had something none of them knew about: the willingness to take a life. The weeks before March 19th are the hardest part of this case to reconstruct with precision. The court focused on what could be proven: the acts, the physical evidence, the disposal sites, the timeline. The inner workings of Dennehy's mind during the lead-up were not, and could not be, fully documented. What the evidence does show is the external picture: a woman whose behaviour was escalating, whose relationships were deteriorating, and whose connection to aggression, already well established through years of documented aggression, was tightening. Dennehy had not suddenly become a different person. She had not experienced a psychotic break, as far as the evidence shows. She had not been provoked by a specific incident that pushed her over an identifiable edge. What happened in March 2013 grew out of the same soil that had produced her entire adult life: instability, aggression, substance misuse, and a pattern of relationships marked by manipulation and control. The difference was one of degree, not of kind. She had always been unstable. Now she was deadly. Meanwhile, the three men who would be targeted were living their ordinary lives. Slabaszewski was going about his routine in the shared housing community. Chapman was doing the same. Kevin Lee was splitting his time between his family and his secret affair, maintaining the fiction that both halves of his life could coexist indefinitely. None of them had plans for what was about to happen. Slabashevsky may have been looking for work. Chapman may have been thinking about the week ahead. Lee had a wife and children who expected him home. All three of them had futures that they assumed would continue. Those futures ended in March. The weeks narrowed to days. The days narrowed to hours. Somewhere in the second half of March 2013, the unpredictable, unstable, aggressive woman who had cycled through years of broken relationships and substance misuse crossed a line that no one around her had anticipated. The first target was Lukasz Slabashevsky. He was 31 years old. He went to see someone he knew. He never came back. What Dennehy did to Slabashevsky was only the beginning. Within 10 days, 2 more men would lose their lives, and it would spread beyond Peterborough entirely. Part 4. Lukasz Slabashevsky was last seen alive on March 19, 2013. He was lured to Joanna Dennehy's residence. The prosecution established that she drew him to a location where she had the advantage, a private space where no one else was present and no one could intervene. He came willingly. He had no reason not to. He knew her. He had interacted with her before. The invitation to visit would not have seemed unusual or alarming. It was the kind of thing that happened routinely in the shared housing community where both of them lived. She attacked him with a knife, striking him repeatedly. The injuries ended his life. Slabashevsky was 31 years old. Afterward, Dennehy removed his body from the location and transported it to a drainage ditch in the rural Cambridgeshire countryside. She left him there, not buried, not hidden in any meaningful way, just placed in a ditch out of sight from the nearest road, where the water and the mud would begin the slow work of concealing what she had done. It was not a sophisticated disposal. It was not the work of someone who feared being caught. One man was gone. His body lay in a ditch. And in the community he had lived in, where people moved frequently and dropped out of contact without warning, nobody raised an alarm. Dennehy returned to her life in Peterborough. She did not flee. She did not change her routine in any observable way. She went back to the same shared housing, the same social circles, the same daily patterns. Days passed. Slabashevsky's absence went unnoticed. In a temporary community, a missing person does not automatically trigger concern. People assume the person moved, changed addresses, found work somewhere else. Slabashevsky's silence was absorbed by the noise of ordinary life. Then Dennehy took another life. The second person she targeted was a 56-year-old man named John Chapman. He knew Dennehy. He was part of the same loose community of shared housing residents that connected most of the people in her orbit. Chapman was not a random target. He was someone whose proximity to Dennehy made him accessible and whose trust in her made him vulnerable. She struck him with a knife again and again. The injuries were life-ending. Chapman was 56 years old. He had lived in Peterborough for a significant period and was part of the community in a way that the younger, more temporary residents were not. He had a history in the city. He had connections. He had people who knew his face, his habits, the places he frequented. His absence left a gap that, in a more visible community, would have been noticed immediately. His body was transported to another ditch in rural Cambridgeshire and left there in the same manner as Slabashevsky's. No burial, no evidence cleaning efforts, just a body in a ditch, left to the elements, and the slow process of discovery that would eventually bring investigators to the scene. 2 men were now gone. Their bodies lay in separate ditches across the Cambridgeshire countryside. The gap between the first and second act was measured in days, not weeks. That compressed timeline was significant. Many offenders who act more than once have cooling-off periods between acts, intervals where the reality of what they have done settles in, and the psychological barriers to acting again must be overcome before the next act. Dennehy showed no such interval. She took Slabashevsky. Days later, she took Chapman's life. The speed of the escalation would later be cited by the judge as evidence of how dangerous she had become. The third person she targeted was the one she knew best. Kevin Lee was taken on March 29, 2013, the last man Dennehy took in those 10 days. He was her landlord. He was her lover. He was a married father whose family had no idea what was happening in the other half of his life. His life ended the same way the others did, struck with a knife, multiple times, at close range. His body was transported and dumped following the same pattern. Another ditch, another body left without burial or concealment. Lee had a wife who was waiting for him to come home. He had children who expected to see their father again. He had a business that needed him, tenants who depended on him, and a life that, for all its complications, was full of people and obligations and the ordinary machinery of an adult existence. His children would grow up without him. His wife would learn not only that her husband was gone, but that he had been having an affair with the woman responsible. The devastation of his loss was compounded by the secrets it exposed, secrets that would have been painful in any circumstance, but were made unbearable by the manner in which they came to light. All of it ended in a matter of minutes, in a room with a woman he had trusted enough to be alone with, a woman who had already taken the lives of 2 other men in the preceding days, and who showed no indication of stopping. 3 men, 10 days, the same method every time. Close-range knife attacks, repeated injuries, disposal in rural ditches. No concealment, no remorse, no hesitation. Scientific analysis confirmed that all 3 men had suffered multiple knife injuries. No other instruments were used. No ligature marks. No evidence of poisoning. No firearms. The method was direct, physical, and forceful in every case. Each act required Dennehy to be within arm's reach of the person in front of her. Each act involved not a single strike but several, delivered with enough force to end a life. The physical nature of the attacks meant Dennehy had been face to face with each person as she ended their lives. There was no distance, no disconnect, no mechanism that allowed her to avoid confronting, in the most immediate possible way, what she was doing to another human being. The evidence that tied Dennehy to the disposal sites was presented at trial and considered strong by the prosecution. Physical evidence connected her to the specific locations where each body had been found. The pattern was undeniable. 3 men, all linked to her, all dispatched the same way, all disposed of in the same manner. The lack of any real concealment effort told investigators something critical. Dennehy had not attempted to bury the bodies, burn them, or destroy evidence. She had not cleaned up afterward. She had not constructed alibis. She had not done any of the things that a person who feared consequences would typically do. The evidence trail she left behind was relatively straightforward to follow once investigators knew where to look. She had not even moved the bodies far from where they fell. The ditches were local. The disposal was crude. The effort was minimal. What this absence of concealment meant, in practical terms, was that the bodies were always going to be found. Dennehy had not hidden them in a way that could have prevented discovery for weeks or months. She had placed them in locations that would delay detection, but not prevent it. Whether she understood this and did not care, or whether the thought simply did not occur to her, the result was the same. The evidence would be found, the pattern would become visible, and the person responsible would be identified. The compressed timeline also worked against any possibility of the acts going undetected. With 3 lives taken in 10 days, each connected to the same social network in Peterborough, the chances of all 3 disappearances being overlooked indefinitely were low. Slabashevsky's absence might have gone unnoticed for a time. Chapman's might have as well. But Kevin Lee had a wife, children, and a business. When he failed to come home, people noticed. Questions were asked, and those questions led investigators toward the ditches where the answers lay. 3 bodies in 3 ditches, and Joanna Dennehy, rather than lying low or fleeing, did something that transformed this case from a series of targeted acts into something far more terrifying. She got in a car with Gary Stretch and drove 100 miles south to Hereford. She was not running, she was hunting. What happened in Peterborough had a pattern. Dennehy knew every one of the men she targeted. What happened next in Hereford shattered that pattern completely. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. Part 5. Shortly after Kevin Lee was gone, Dennehy left Peterborough. She did not go into hiding. She did not head for an airport or a port. She travelled roughly 100 miles south to Hereford, near the Welsh border, accompanied by Gary Stretch. What happened in Hereford changed the nature of the case entirely. In Peterborough, Dennehy had targeted men she knew. Slabashevsky, Chapman, and Lee were all part of her world. She had personal connections to each of them. She used trust and proximity to gain access and carry out the acts in private. That pattern, while deeply disturbing, was at least bounded by the limits of her social circle. The people at risk were the people who knew her. In Hereford, those boundaries disappeared. Dennehy attacked 2 men she had never met before in her life. The men she targeted were dog walkers. They were out in a public area during the day, doing something they had probably done hundreds of times before, something so routine and unremarkable that it required no thought at all. They had no connection to Dennehy. They were not part of her social network, her housing world, or any aspect of her personal life. They were strangers who happened to be in a park at the same time as a woman who had already taken 3 lives, and who was, by all indications, looking for more. They were selected for one reason. They were there. Dennehy attacked both of them with a knife, without hesitation or warning. The assaults were sudden and close range, carried out with the same direct physical force she had used in Peterborough. The men had no opportunity to assess the threat, defend themselves, or escape before the blade made contact. Both men survived. One suffered serious injuries requiring significant medical intervention. The fact that they lived was not due to any restraint on Dennehy's part. She attacked them with the same force and intent she had used against the 3 men whose lives she took. The difference in outcome came down to circumstance, the depth of the injuries, the speed of the emergency response, the location of the injuries, not mercy. 5 people attacked in less than 2 weeks, 3 gone, 2 barely alive, and the attacker had just demonstrated that she would stab anyone she encountered, regardless of whether she had ever seen them before. For the police forces that would later review the case, the Hereford attacks raised a specific and urgent question. If Dennehy had not been caught that day, who would have been next? The dog walkers were not selected through any process of deliberation. They were simply present. Any person walking through that area at that time could have been targeted. That randomness meant the threat Dennehy posed could not be contained by geography, social circles, or any predictable pattern. She had become a danger to anyone she encountered. The attacks took place in daylight, in a public area. Dennehy made no attempt to conceal herself, select an isolated location, or avoid witnesses. This was consistent with everything investigators had already observed about her behaviour. She was not concerned about being caught. She was not thinking about consequences. She was acting on an internal drive that, by this point, appeared to override every normal restraint that prevents human beings from harming strangers. The Hereford attacks also ended the case. Following the attacks, Dennehy was apprehended by police. The arrest was straightforward. She did not resist significantly. There was no standoff, no chase, and no serious attempt to evade capture. After 10 days of attacking with apparent impunity, Dennehy's spree ended with a quiet arrest. The contrast between the severity of what she did and the mundanity of the arrest was striking. A woman who had attacked 5 people with a knife, taking 3 lives, was taken into custody without drama. There was no final confrontation, no moment of defiance, no last act of harm. Dennehy simply stopped, not because she chose to, but because the police reached her before she could attack anyone else. Whether she would have continued if given the opportunity is a question the court did not need to answer directly, but the pattern of escalation, from 3 targeted acts to 2 random attacks in the space of less than 2 weeks, left little room for doubt. The officers who made the arrest later described a woman who showed no distress at being taken into custody, no panic, and no apparent concern about what would happen next. She was as calm in handcuffs as she had been in the moments before the attacks. The arrest in Hereford also meant that the investigation, which had been unfolding in Cambridgeshire as missing persons inquiries slowly transformed into something far more serious, now had a suspect in custody. The physical evidence that had been accumulating at the disposal sites could now be matched to a specific individual. The timeline of disappearances could be aligned with Dennehy's known movements. The connections between those involved and the suspect could be formally established. The case, which had been fragmentary and confusing just days earlier, was rapidly becoming clear. Gary Stretch was also taken into custody. He would later plead guilty to assisting an offender, acknowledging that he had helped Dennehy after what happened by accompanying her, transporting her, and providing support during the critical days between what happened in Peterborough and the point arrest in Hereford. His role raised its own questions. Stretch had been with Dennehy during and after what happened. He had known what she had done. He had chosen to help her rather than contact the police. Whatever his reasons, whether fear, loyalty, or something else entirely, his decision to assist a woman who had taken 3 lives made him involved in the aftermath of what happened. The surviving men in Hereford were able to provide accounts of the attacks. Their testimony gave police a description of the attacker, the circumstances of the attacks, and the sequence of events that led to the arrest. Because the attacks occurred in daylight in a public area, the identification and apprehension of Dennehy was faster than it might have been otherwise. In Peterborough, the acts had gone undetected for days because they occurred in private, and those affected were part of a temporary community where absences went unremarked. In Hereford, the harm was immediate, visible, and reported to police almost in real time. Dennehy was in custody, but the full scale of what she had done was only beginning to emerge. Part 6. The investigation had begun before Dennehy was arrested, though initially it did not look like an investigation at all. Lukasz Slabashevsky, John Chapman, and Kevin Lee had each been reported missing during March 2013 at different points and through different channels. In a community where people moved frequently and dropped out of contact without notice, the initial missing persons inquiries did not trigger an immediate large-scale police response. People disappeared from Peterborough's shared housing network all the time. Most of them turned up eventually, in another city, at another address, having simply moved on without telling anyone. But these three never resurfaced. Their bodies were found in drainage ditches across rural Cambridgeshire. The discovery transformed the investigation. What had been routine missing persons cases became an inquiry covering multiple people, multiple disposal sites, and a timeline that compressed 3 lives lost in 10 days. When evidence teams examined the bodies, the pattern was unmistakable. 3 men, all struck with a knife repeatedly, all disposed of in the same way, all linked to the same woman. Physical evidence linked Dennehy to the disposal sites. The prosecution would later present this evidence at trial in detail, establishing a clear chain of connection between Dennehy, each person, and the specific location where each body was found. The physical evidence was strong. The timeline was supported by witness accounts and phone records. The picture that emerged was comprehensive and damning. What happened in Hereford had provided the critical breakthrough for identification and arrest. Because the attacks on the dog walkers occurred in a public area during the day, there were witnesses and a trail that police could follow quickly. Once Dennehy was in custody, Cambridgeshire detectives were able to connect her to what happened in Peterborough through the accumulated physical and circumstantial evidence. What had appeared to be separate incidents, 3 missing men in one city and 2 attacks in another, were revealed as the work of a single person. The investigation also had to operate across 2 police force areas. The cases fell under Cambridgeshire Constabulary. The attempted cases fell under West Mercia Police in Hereford. Coordinating physical evidence, witness testimony, and case files across police areas required careful management. The fact that the investigation produced a unified and comprehensive case against Dennehy was a reflection of the cooperation between the 2 forces. The formal charges were laid: 3 charges for taking a life, 2 charges for the attempted taking of a life. The evidence supported every one of them. Each charge carried the weight of a life taken. Slabashevsky, Chapman, Lee. 3 names. 3 men who had been alive at the start of March 2013 and who were gone before the month was out. The attempted charges covered the 2 dog walkers in Hereford, men who had survived only because the injuries Dennehy inflicted, though serious, had not ended their lives. Together, the 5 charges encompassed every known act of harm Dennehy had caused during the 10-day period. Gary Stretch was charged separately with assisting an offender. His guilty plea confirmed that he had been aware of what happened and had chosen to help Dennehy rather than contact the authorities. His involvement demonstrated that Dennehy had not acted in complete isolation. She had carried out the acts herself, but in the aftermath, she had at least one person who chose to stand by her. Investigators also examined the broader circumstances of Dennehy's life before what happened. They looked at her living arrangements, her social connections, her substance use, her relationship with Kevin Lee, and the behavioural history that had defined her for years. This background work was essential for establishing motive, or rather, for establishing the absence of one. What investigators found instead of a motive was a pattern. Phone records, witness statements, and the physical evidence all pointed to a woman who had moved from one target to the next without any external trigger. There was no argument that preceded any of the attacks, no theft, no financial dispute. The absence of any identifiable cause became itself the most important finding of the investigation. The investigation moved quickly once the connection between the cases became clear. Detectives reconstructed Dennehy's movements day by day through phone records, witness interviews, and CCTV where available. They mapped her social network in Peterborough to identify who she had been in contact with and when. They traced the route she and Stretch had taken to Hereford, identifying stops, fuel purchases, and points of contact along the way. Each piece of evidence narrowed the picture further until the timeline was complete and the case against Dennehy was airtight. It was Kevin Lee's disappearance that cracked the case open. Unlike Slabashevsky and Chapman, Lee had a wife who expected him home, a business with appointments he was supposed to keep, and a phone that stopped being answered. His absence set off the alarm that the other two disappearances had not. Once investigators began looking into Lee's last known contacts, Dennehy's name surfaced almost immediately. From there, the connections to Slabashevsky and Chapman followed in rapid succession. Dennehy did what she did because she wanted to. That was the conclusion the evidence pointed toward, and it was the conclusion the court would reach. Part 7. The trial of Joanna Dennehy took place in 2014. It attracted national media coverage across the United Kingdom and drew attention from international outlets as well. A female repeat offender of this kind was almost unheard of in modern British history, and the specific details of the case, the randomness of the later attacks, the lack of any clear motive, the speed of the spree, and the apparent pleasure the case defendant took in what she did, ensured that every major news outlet in the country followed the proceedings closely from beginning to end. Dennehy did not fight the charges. She pleaded guilty to all 3 counts. She pleaded guilty to the attempted taking of both men she had attacked in Hereford. The pleas were clear and unconditional. There was no claim of diminished responsibility, no plea of manslaughter, no attempt to reframe or minimise what she had done as anything other than exactly what it was. With guilt established by her own admission, the only question left was the sentence. And in the English legal system, there was only one sentence reserved for the most extreme cases. The prosecution presented the full body of evidence to the court, not to prove guilt, since Dennehy had already admitted to everything, but to establish the severity and context of her offences for sentencing purposes. The scientific evidence was laid out, the timeline was reconstructed, the investigation's findings were presented in detail, and the judge heard it all. In his sentencing remarks, the judge described Dennehy in terms that left no room for ambiguity. He called her sadistic, he called her manipulative, he called her dangerous. He found, based on the totality of the evidence, that she posed a lifelong risk to the public, a risk that could not be reduced or contained by any measure short of permanent imprisonment. The judge's assessment was not rhetorical. In English criminal law, the formal characterization of a defendant's danger level directly determines the available sentencing options. For those deemed to pose a permanent threat, the law allows for the handing down of a whole life order. A whole life order is the most severe sentence in the English legal system. It means life imprisonment with no minimum term, no parole eligibility, no review, no hearing at which the offender can petition for release. The sentence is absolute. The offender will remain in prison until the day they die. The judge imposed a whole life order on Joanna Dennehy. She would never leave prison. The door closed behind her, permanently. When the judge read the sentence aloud, the courtroom was still. The families of the 3 men sat in rows behind the prosecution. Dennehy stood in the dock. The word that carried the most weight was not sadistic, not dangerous, not even the phrase whole life order. It was the word never. Dennehy would never be released, never be reviewed, never stand before a parole board. The sentence removed her from the world permanently, and everyone in that room understood exactly what that meant. The number of women who have ever received a whole life sentence in the United Kingdom can be counted on one hand. Dennehy joined that group, a group defined by the most extreme acts of harm the British criminal justice system has ever encountered from female offenders. The rarity of the sentence reflected the rarity of what she did. What Dennehy did in March 2013, the method, the frequency, the escalation, and the apparent pleasure she took in it, placed her in territory that the courts almost never encounter. The judge made clear in his remarks that he had considered whether any lesser sentence could serve the public interest. He concluded that it could not. The risk Dennehy posed was not theoretical. It was demonstrated, documented, and ongoing. The whole life order was not a punishment calibrated to the severity of past acts alone. It was a protective measure aimed at preventing future ones. Gary Stretch was also sentenced for assisting an offender. His guilty plea confirmed his role in helping Dennehy after what happened and during the journey to Hereford. His sentence reflected his secondary but significant involvement in the events. The trial also exposed the mechanics of what Dennehy did in a way that no news report ever could. The prosecution walked through each act individually, reconstructing the sequence from first contact to disposal with a level of detail that left nothing to imagination. The method, the locations, the condition of the bodies when they were recovered. Each fact was entered into the record with clinical precision, building a complete picture that was as thorough as it was difficult to hear. The families of the three men sat through every session. They listened to the evidence details, the clinical descriptions of injuries, the cold recitation of dates and locations. For them, these were not case exhibits. They were the final chapters of lives they had shared. Lee's family, in particular, absorbed a double blow: the loss of a husband and father, and the simultaneous revelation of the affair that had placed him in Dennehy's path. The courtroom forced them to process both at once, in public, under the gaze of national media. The whole life order, when it was pronounced, was the legal system's final word on the matter. Dennehy would die in prison. She would never be reconsidered for release. The sentence was not a recommendation or a guideline. It was a permanent, irrevocable judgment that this particular person was too dangerous to ever be allowed back into the world. And with that, the legal proceedings ended. The sentence was final. But what Dennehy displayed during those proceedings told investigators something that the physical evidence alone never could. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into cases that don't get the attention they deserve. Part 8. Throughout the proceedings, everyone in the courtroom watched Dennehy: the judge, the prosecution, the defense, the reporters in the gallery, the families of the three men she had taken. They watched her, and what they saw was consistent with everything the evidence had already established. She showed no remorse. Court reporting described Dennehy as smirking during the proceedings. She appeared to relish the attention. The notoriety seemed to please her. There was no visible distress, no moments of regret, no indication, through any expression or gesture, that the detailed recounting of how she had attacked 5 people with a knife, taking 3 of their lives, caused her any discomfort at all. While the families of Łukasz Slabaszewski, John Chapman and Kevin Lee sat in that courtroom, Dennehy showed no sign that their grief registered with her. Statements Dennehy had made before the trial were presented as evidence during the proceedings. In those statements, she spoke about enjoying harm. These were not ambiguous remarks open to interpretation. They were direct expressions of pleasure in causing harm, and the prosecution used them to support the characterization of Dennehy as someone who derived genuine satisfaction from the act itself. The distinction matters. A defendant who sits quietly through their trial, showing little emotion, can be stoic, numb, or simply controlled. That is not what observers described in Dennehy's case. What they described was engagement, interest, a visible comfort with her own notoriety that went beyond composure and into something that multiple independent accounts marked as enjoyment. This was consistent with the pattern of the acts themselves. Dennehy had taken 3 lives in 10 days, dumped their bodies in ditches, and immediately gone on to stab 2 strangers. At no point during the 10-day spree did she hesitate, reconsider, or attempt to stop. The courtroom behaviour was not a performance. It was a continuation of the same attitude she had carried throughout the entire sequence of events. Experienced detectives, people who had spent careers working serious cases, found this case unusually difficult. Not because of the forensics, because of the person sitting in the dock. For the families of the affected families, the courtroom experience added a layer of pain to an already devastating situation. They had lost fathers, sons, and partners to deliberate acts of harm. Now they sat in a room with the person responsible and watched her appear comfortable throughout the proceedings. The contrast between their grief and her apparent indifference was noted repeatedly in media reporting and became one of the defining images of the trial. For the 2 survivors of the Hereford attacks, the trial carried its own particular weight. They had been attacked without warning by a complete stranger for no discernible reason, on an ordinary afternoon, in a place they had walked through countless times before. Learning the full extent of what the person who attacked them had already done in Peterborough added layers of trauma that the legal process could acknowledge but not resolve. They had survived a direct encounter with someone who had done this before. They had not known it at the time. The full gravity and horror of what had happened to them only became clear as the trial laid out the complete sequence of events. What made the courtroom experience particularly difficult for those present was the disconnect between the procedural calm of the legal process and the weight of what was being described. The judge maintained composure. The barristers spoke in measured tones. The court clerk recorded everything in silence. And within that controlled environment, the details of how 3 men had been attacked and left in ditches were laid out, with the same formality that might accompany a contract dispute or a planning application. The ordinariness of the process stood in sharp contrast to the extraordinary nature of what happened. Dennehy's guilty plea had spared the court a lengthy trial to determine guilt, but it had not spared anyone from the full weight of the evidence. The forensic details, the testimony about the condition of the bodies, the accounts from the survivors, and Dennehy's own recorded statements about the pleasure she took in causing harm. All of it was presented, all of it was absorbed by the people in that courtroom. And through it all, Dennehy smirked. The behaviour she displayed became, for many observers, the single most memorable aspect of the case. Not the forensic evidence, not the timeline, not even what happened. It was the smirk, the visible satisfaction, the total absence of anything resembling human remorse in a room full of people whose lives she had shattered. That image, Dennehy in the dock, visibly comfortable with what she had done, was the detail that stayed with the reporters who covered the trial, the investigators who built the case, and the public who followed it from a distance. It also informed the judge's sentencing decision. The absence of remorse was not merely a disturbing observation, it was evidence. It supported the conclusion that Dennehy posed a permanent risk because she showed no capacity for the kind of self-reflection that rehabilitation depends upon. A defendant who expresses genuine remorse, even belatedly, gives the court at least a theoretical basis for considering future change. Dennehy offered nothing of the kind. Her demeanour confirmed what her actions had already demonstrated. She felt no regret, and there was no credible basis for believing she ever would. The courtroom revealed who Dennehy was. The psychological evidence presented at trial attempted to explain why. Part 9. The evidence presented at trial allowed the court to draw specific conclusions about the kind of person Joanna Dennehy was and the kind of threat she represented. These conclusions were grounded in facts, not in speculation or clinical theory. The judge did not formally diagnose Dennehy with any specific psychiatric condition. He assessed what she had done, what she had said, and what she had shown throughout the proceedings, and he reached findings that were supported by the evidence before him. He described her as sadistic. That word was chosen carefully and deliberately. It was not a rhetorical flourish or a casual expression of disapproval. It was a considered legal characterization, meaning that the evidence established, to the court's satisfaction, that Dennehy derived genuine pleasure from the act of inflicting suffering and harm on other human beings. The evidence for that conclusion was not limited to the acts themselves. It included her own words. Dennehy had made statements before the trial, in which she spoke openly about the pleasure she derived from causing harm. She had displayed that same pleasure in the courtroom when the details of her case was recounted. She had shown no remorse at any stage, not during the act, not during the investigation, and not during the trial. The judge's use of the word sadistic was the product of all of this evidence taken together. What the court found most significant was the internal nature of Dennehy's motivation. In most cases that reach this stage of sentencing, the judge can point to an external factor that drove the offending, a trigger that, if removed, might reduce future risk. With Dennehy, there was no such factor. The drive was entirely internal. It came from within her and appeared to operate independently of her circumstances, her relationships, or anything happening in the external world. That made her uniquely difficult to assess, because the standard tools for measuring and managing risk depend on identifying external factors that can be addressed. When the motivation is purely internal, those tools have nothing to work with. The people were not the point. The harm was the point. That was the most disturbing finding the court reached. What set Dennehy apart from most documented cases was the complete absence of any internal resistance to what she was doing. Many offenders who commit repeated acts of harm show signs of psychological distress between incidents, difficulty sleeping, increased substance use, withdrawal from normal routines, attempts to flee, or confessions driven by guilt. Dennehy displayed none of this. She moved from one act to the next without anxiety, without hesitation, and without any visible change in her daily behaviour. The only change was that she sought out more targets. To the court, this indicated a psychological profile in which the normal human responses to having caused serious harm, whether guilt, fear, or even basic self-preservation, were entirely absent. The judge also considered the trajectory. Most offenders who are assessed for whole life orders have committed their offences over longer periods, sometimes years. Dennehy compressed hers into days. That compression suggested not a slow deterioration, but an appetite that was accelerating. The court concluded that had she not been arrested in Hereford, there was no reason to believe she would have stopped on her own. This conclusion was reinforced by the direction her conduct had taken. Dennehy had started with people she knew, people whose trust she had already earned, and whose proximity she could exploit. When those targets were exhausted, she moved to strangers. When Peterborough was no longer enough, she travelled to a new city. Each step represented an expansion of scope, not a contraction. The boundaries around her behaviour were not tightening, they were dissolving. The court could find no evidence of any internal limit, no line she would not cross, no category of person she would refuse to target. That open-ended and unbounded quality to the threat she posed was what ultimately made the whole life order not just appropriate, but the only responsible option available to the court. The court's conclusion was straightforward. Dennehy was a person for whom causing harm was its own sufficient reward, and that made her permanently dangerous. That assessment, grounded entirely in the evidence and not in theoretical speculation, was what ultimately determined Dennehy's sentence. The whole life order was not a punishment chosen for its symbolic value. It was the court's practical determination that no lesser measure could protect the public from a person whose appetite for harm showed no boundaries, no triggers, and no signs of ever diminishing. The psychological picture that emerged from the trial was, in certain respects, more alarming than many cases of repeat offending that have attracted greater public attention. Offenders who take lives for identifiable reasons, however twisted, are at least comprehensible within a framework of human motivation. A person who kills for money can be understood through greed. A person who kills to conceal what they did can be understood through self-preservation. A person who kills a specific individual out of revenge can be understood through rage. What Dennehy did offered no such framework. She did not act for anything recognisable. She did it because the act itself was what she wanted. That absence of external motive, combined with the escalation to random attacks, the total lack of remorse, and the compressed timeline of the attacks, placed Dennehy in a category of offender that the criminal justice system encounters very rarely. The whole life order was the system's response to that rarity. It was an acknowledgement that the tools designed to manage most offenders, rehabilitation, parole conditions, supervised release, were simply not adequate for the threat Dennehy represented. The analysis is complete. What remains is the permanent reality of what Joanna Dennehy left behind. Part 10. Joanna Dennehy is currently held within the United Kingdom prison system. The whole life order imposed at her sentencing remains in full effect. She has no parole eligibility. There is no mechanism for her to apply for release, attend a hearing, or petition for a reduction in her sentence. She will remain in prison until her last day. The sentence places her in an extraordinarily rare category within the English and Welsh legal system. At the time it was imposed, fewer than a handful of women in the entire history of England and Wales had ever received a whole life sentence. The vast majority of such sentences have been given to men convicted of the most extreme and repeated forms of taking life. Dennehy's inclusion in that group reflects both the severity of what she did and the court's determination that she would remain dangerous indefinitely. Nothing in the years since her sentencing has altered that outcome. The door remains closed. It will not open. The case has become a significant reference point in broader discussions about female serial offending in the United Kingdom and beyond. Academic researchers, legal commentators, and criminologists have cited it in analyses of how the criminal justice system understands and responds to women who commit extreme, repeated, and apparently motiveless offending. The rarity of such cases means each one receives outsized attention and carries outsized significance in the wider conversation about offending, gender, sentencing, and public safety policy. Dennehy's case is also cited in ongoing discussions about the whole life tariff itself. Critics of the sentence argue that permanent imprisonment with no possibility of review raises questions about fairness and the purpose of incarceration. Supporters point to cases like Dennehy's as evidence that some offenders pose a risk that can never be safely managed outside of custody, no matter how many years pass. The debate continues in legal and academic circles, and it will continue for as long as the sentence exists. Dennehy's case remains one of its clearest and most frequently cited examples, a case where the facts leave little room for ambiguity about the necessity of the sentence imposed. For the broader public, the case served as a reminder that the capacity for extreme and repeated harm is not confined to any one gender, background, or circumstance, and that the legal system must be equipped to respond when it emerges. For the families left behind, the sentence changed nothing about their daily reality. The legal process concluded, the courtroom emptied, the reporters packed up their notepads